How could you keep this from me? I trusted you with everything, and now it is all gone.
My best friend looked me in the eyes and said, "If you ever betray me, I will never forgive you." The hardest part was he had no idea I was already in love with the one person he never imagined, his mother. At first, it sounds like the kind of confession people dismiss without hearing the full story. It sounds wrong before anyone knows the facts. It sounds like the ending of a friendship that had survived childhood, adulthood, marriage, heartbreak, and every challenge life could throw at it. But the truth rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it unfolds so slowly that by the time you realize everything has changed, there's no path back to the life you once knew. How does a man fall in love with a woman who helped raise his best friend? Was it betrayal? Was it genuine love? Why did an entire family turn against them? And what forgotten secret, hidden inside a dusty box for more than 40 years, had the power to change everything they believed about loyalty, forgiveness, and second chances? Stay with me until the very end, because this story isn't simply about romance. It's about grief, loneliness, aging, family, impossible choices, and the question that divides people even today: does love ever arrive at the wrong time, or do we simply judge it before we understand it? Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What you're about to hear is inspired by the kinds of real-life relationships and family conflicts that have happened to ordinary people across America, where unexpected love has challenged traditions, friendships, and deeply held beliefs. Some details have been changed, and the names are fictional to protect privacy. But the emotions, the difficult choices, and the painful consequences reflect situations that many families have quietly faced. This is the story of Daniel Brooks, a 52-year-old divorced architect from Charleston, South Carolina, and his lifelong best friend, Michael Carter, a man who trusted Daniel more than almost anyone else in the world. Their friendship had lasted for 4 decades, surviving childhood adventures, military service, failed marriages, career changes, and countless moments that would have ended weaker friendships. There was never any reason to imagine that one unexpected relationship would place all those years of loyalty on one side of the scale, while love rested on the other. And by the end of this story, one family would be divided forever, and one secret, written down more than 40 years earlier, would change everyone's understanding of love. There are some friendships that become so deeply rooted in your life that you stop thinking of them as friendships at all. They become family. They become the people who know your past, understand your silence, and can recognize your voice even after years apart. For Daniel Brooks and Michael Carter, that bond began long before either of them understood what adulthood would demand of them. They met in the summer of 1986 on a quiet street in Charleston, South Carolina, after a baseball accidentally crashed through the Carter family's front window. Daniel, only 12 years old, was terrified that the angry homeowner would demand money his widowed mother simply didn't have. Instead, the front door opened, and standing there was a smiling woman named Evelyn Carter. Rather than yelling, she picked up the baseball, handed it back to the nervous boy, and simply asked him to be more careful next time. Moments later, another boy came running out of the house, introduced himself as Michael, and asked Daniel if he wanted to finish the game. Neither of them knew that a broken window had just begun a friendship that would last more than 40 years. As the years passed, Daniel became a permanent part of the Carter household. He celebrated birthdays there, spent countless weekends sleeping over, and even joined the family on vacations whenever his own mother couldn't afford to travel. Michael's father, Robert Carter, treated Daniel like another son, teaching both boys how to fish, repair old engines, and work with their hands. Evelyn became the steady presence who made sure there was always enough food on the table, and someone to listen whenever either boy struggled with school, relationships, or the uncertainty that comes with growing up. Daniel admired her the way any grateful teenager would admire a caring adult. She was patient without being weak, wise without pretending to know everything, and kind in a way that never asked for recognition. There was never the slightest hint that life would someday place them in circumstances neither of them could have imagined. To Daniel, Evelyn wasn't simply Michael's mother. She was one of the people who helped shape the man he would become. Life eventually carried the two friends in different directions before bringing them together again. After high school, Daniel joined the military, while Michael stayed in Charleston to help expand his father's construction business. Years later, Daniel earned a degree in architecture, married his college sweetheart, and built a respected career designing homes throughout South Carolina. Michael married as well, raised two children, and continued working alongside his father until Robert unexpectedly passed away following a brief illness. Time, however, proved that success doesn't protect anyone from heartbreak. Daniel's marriage quietly fell apart after nearly 23 years, ending in a divorce that left him living alone in a house that suddenly felt far too large. Michael's own marriage survived, but it was tested by financial setbacks and family responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier with every passing year. Through every victory and every disappointment, the one constant that never disappeared was their friendship. They still met for coffee every Saturday morning, still attended each other's family gatherings, and still laughed about the reckless decisions they had made as teenagers. After Robert Carter's death, something changed inside the Carter family. Evelyn continued living in the same beautiful home she had shared with her husband for more than 4 decades, but everyone noticed the difference. The laughter that once filled the house became rare. Family dinners became smaller. The woman who had spent her entire adult life caring for everyone else now spent most evenings alone, quietly reading in the living room or tending to the garden she and Robert had planted together years earlier. Michael worried constantly about his mother, but balancing work, his own family, and daily responsibilities meant he couldn't visit as often as he wanted. Daniel, having more flexibility in his schedule, began stopping by every week. Sometimes he repaired a loose cabinet door. Other times he mowed the lawn, carried heavy grocery bags inside, or fixed things Robert would have handled himself. He never considered these visits unusual. To him, it was simply what friends did for one another, especially after losing someone who had meant so much to them. What Daniel couldn't see was how those ordinary visits slowly became the brightest part of Evelyn's week. Their conversations, which initially lasted only a few minutes, gradually stretched into hours over cups of coffee on the back porch. They talked about books, old Charleston memories, changing neighborhoods, and the strange feeling of watching the world move faster with every passing year. Daniel found himself looking forward to those afternoons more than he wanted to admit. Though he convinced himself it was only because he enjoyed helping someone who had once helped him. The thought of anything beyond friendship never crossed his mind. At least, not yet. But life has a way of changing the meaning of ordinary moments so quietly that we rarely notice until everything feels different. And before long, one simple conversation would make Daniel question emotions he never believed were possible, setting in motion a chain of events that would test the strongest friendship he had ever known. If someone had asked Daniel Brooks 6 months earlier whether he could ever imagine falling in love with Evelyn Carter, he would have laughed at the suggestion. The very idea would have sounded absurd. Evelyn had always been part of the Carter family in his mind, someone he respected and admired in the same way he had for decades. She was Michael's mother, the woman who had welcomed him into her home when he was just a frightened 12-year-old boy carrying more worries than any child should. She had celebrated his victories, comforted him through disappointments, and stood proudly beside Michael's family during every major milestone of his life. There had never been a moment when Daniel looked at her through the eyes of a man searching for romance. Yet life has a remarkable way of changing people without asking permission. The transformation rarely happens in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it arrives quietly, disguised as ordinary conversations, shared laughter, and the comfort of being understood by someone who asks for nothing except your honesty. Daniel's visits to Evelyn's home became a regular part of his weekly routine. Sometimes he would stop by after finishing work, carrying fresh bread from a local bakery because he remembered she loved homemade sandwiches. Other times he would spend an entire Saturday repairing loose fence panels, cleaning gutters, or helping organize old family photographs that had remained untouched since Robert Carter's passing. What surprised Daniel wasn't the work itself. It was how reluctant he had become to leave. Their conversations had grown longer without either of them noticing. They spoke about aging parents, childhood dreams, the disappointment of broken marriages, and the strange loneliness that often follows retirement or divorce. Daniel realized he could speak to Evelyn about subjects he had never discussed with anyone else, not even Michael. There was no judgment in her responses, only patience, understanding, and a quiet wisdom earned through decades of living, loving, and losing. For the first time since his divorce, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Evelyn, meanwhile, had also begun noticing changes she couldn't explain. 4 years after Robert's death, every day had followed the same lonely pattern. She would wake up to an empty house, prepare breakfast for one, tend her flowers, read for a while, and wait for occasional phone calls from Michael or Sarah. Holidays became painful reminders of what had been lost, and evenings felt especially long. Although her children loved her deeply, they had families and responsibilities of their own. She never blamed them for living their lives, but she couldn't deny the silence that settled over the house once visitors left. Daniel's visits slowly interrupted that silence. He never treated her like someone who needed pity. He laughed with her instead of feeling sorry for her. He asked for her opinions on books, architecture, history, and current events, genuinely interested in what she thought. It had been years since anyone had looked at her as a woman whose thoughts still mattered, instead of simply an elderly widow deserving sympathy. Without realizing it, Daniel had given Evelyn something she believed had disappeared forever: the feeling that she was still truly seen. As spring turned into summer, their friendship deepened in ways neither expected. They began taking short walks through Charleston's historic district after dinner, stopping to admire old homes Daniel had always loved designing. Evelyn shared stories about raising Michael and Sarah, stories Daniel had never heard despite knowing the family for most of his life. She spoke about Robert with warmth rather than sadness, remembering the adventures they had shared instead of dwelling on his absence. Daniel noticed that she smiled more often now, and the sadness that had once clouded her expression seemed lighter each week. One afternoon, while sitting on a bench overlooking the harbor, Evelyn laughed so hard at one of Daniel's terrible jokes that strangers turned to see what was so funny. Daniel found himself smiling long after the conversation had ended. Driving home that evening, he caught himself replaying every moment of the day in his mind. It wasn't excitement that unsettled him. It was the realization that he hadn't thought about his loneliness once while he was with her. That night, Daniel stood alone in his kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. For the first time, he forced himself to confront a question he had been avoiding without even realizing it. Why was he thinking about Evelyn so often? Why did he look forward to seeing her more than anyone else? Why did the thought of her spending another evening alone bother him so deeply? The answers frightened him because they challenged everything he believed about loyalty and friendship. Michael trusted him completely. The Carter family had treated him like one of their own for over 40 years. If these feelings were real, what would they mean? Was he betraying the people who had loved him like family? Or was he simply discovering that love sometimes appears where no one expects it? Daniel tried convincing himself the emotions would fade if he spent less time with Evelyn, but every attempt only made him realize how much her presence had become a part of his life. And then, during one quiet afternoon on Evelyn's back porch, she looked out toward the garden Robert had planted years earlier before softly saying something that would stay with Daniel forever. "I never imagined I could laugh this much again after losing my husband. Somehow, whenever you're here, this house doesn't feel empty anymore." Those words settled heavily between them. Neither spoke for several moments, but both understood that something had changed. Neither of them knew how to stop it, and neither could imagine where it would lead next. There is a moment in every life when what has remained hidden quietly steps into the light. It doesn't happen because someone intends for it to. It happens because secrets become heavier with time, and even the most careful people eventually make one small mistake. For Daniel Brooks and Evelyn Carter, that moment arrived on an ordinary Saturday afternoon that began no differently than dozens before it. Daniel had offered to help Evelyn prepare her backyard for her annual family barbecue, a tradition she refused to abandon even after Robert's passing. They spent the morning trimming hedges, cleaning the patio furniture, and hanging old lanterns that had decorated family gatherings for years. The work was simple, but the conversations were meaningful. They laughed about memories from Michael's childhood, debated whether Daniel had ever learned to grill properly, and teased each other about whose favorite baseball team would have the better season. For anyone watching from a distance, they looked like two people enjoying the company of an old friend. Yet the comfort between them had grown into something neither could honestly deny anymore. It wasn't built on excitement or impulse. It had been formed through months of trust, respect, shared loneliness, and countless conversations that had slowly connected two hearts carrying similar scars. Still, both understood that admitting those feelings aloud would change everything. The first person to notice was not Michael. It was his younger sister, Sarah Carter. Sarah had always been fiercely protective of her mother. Since Robert's death, she visited whenever her schedule allowed, often bringing groceries or helping with appointments. Unlike Michael, who believed Daniel's frequent visits were simply another example of his loyalty, Sarah paid attention to the little things other people overlooked. She noticed how her mother's face brightened whenever Daniel's truck pulled into the driveway. She noticed that Daniel no longer rushed home after finishing repairs, but stayed for dinner almost every time. She noticed fresh flowers on the kitchen table that Daniel insisted were just because the garden looked lonely. More importantly, she noticed the silence that settled over both of them whenever someone unexpectedly entered the room. It wasn't the silence of guilt. It was the silence of two people afraid that others had already figured out what they were still struggling to admit to themselves. Sarah left that afternoon with an uneasy feeling she couldn't explain, and over the following weeks, that feeling slowly transformed into suspicion. Charleston is a beautiful city, but like many close-knit communities, conversations travel quickly. Familiar faces recognize one another in grocery stores, restaurants, church services, and neighborhood cafes. It didn't take long before people began noticing Daniel and Evelyn together. They were seen having coffee downtown after attending a local charity fundraiser. They walked through the historic district discussing architecture. They shared lunch after volunteering at a community food drive. None of those moments were inappropriate. Yet taken together, they became the kind of story that invites assumptions. Soon whispers replaced greetings whenever they entered certain places. Some believed Daniel had simply become a compassionate friend helping a lonely widow. Others weren't so charitable. A few quietly suggested he was interested in Evelyn's comfortable financial situation. Others insisted she was too vulnerable after losing Robert to recognize that she was being manipulated. No one asked Daniel or Evelyn what the truth actually was. Instead, opinions formed long before facts ever had a chance. It reminded Daniel of something his father once told him. People often judge what they don't understand because assumptions require far less effort than compassion. Daniel became painfully aware of the growing gossip during a Sunday church service when he noticed conversations suddenly stop as he walked past several longtime acquaintances. Later that afternoon, while picking up coffee, he overheard two men casually discussing the architect chasing his best friend's inheritance. They didn't know he was standing only a few feet away. Every word struck harder than Daniel expected because it attacked the very thing he valued most: his integrity. He had spent his entire life earning the trust of those around him. He had never borrowed money he couldn't repay, never taken advantage of vulnerable people, and never given Michael a reason to question his loyalty. Yet now strangers who knew nothing about his heart believed they had already written the ending to his story. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his living room, wondering if the only honorable choice was to stop visiting Evelyn altogether. Perhaps distance would protect everyone involved. Perhaps sacrificing his own happiness was the price of preserving a friendship that had lasted more than 40 years. The thought left him feeling emptier than he had since the day his marriage ended. A few days later, Daniel drove to Evelyn's house intending to tell her exactly that. He had rehearsed the conversation during the entire drive. He would explain that the rumors were becoming harmful, that Michael deserved better than becoming the subject of neighborhood gossip, and that they should return to the simple friendship they once shared. But the moment Evelyn opened the front door, Daniel realized something was different. Her eyes were red, and it was obvious she had been crying. Before he could say a single word, she quietly admitted that Sarah had confronted her the previous evening, asking whether there was something she wasn't telling the family. Evelyn hadn't answered because she wasn't ready to put feelings into words she barely understood herself. She looked at Daniel with a mixture of sadness and quiet certainty before speaking the sentence neither of them could take back. "I've spent months trying to convince myself this would pass," she said softly. "But it hasn't. Daniel, I think I've fallen in love with you." Time seemed to stop. Daniel stood motionless, unable to find the words he had practiced only minutes earlier. The conversation he intended to have disappeared completely. In its place stood a truth neither of them could deny anymore. What neither of them realized was that outside the house, a familiar vehicle had just pulled into the driveway, and within moments, the one person they feared hurting most would unknowingly step into a moment that would change all of their lives forever. Some discoveries don't happen because someone was searching for the truth. They happen because life places the truth directly in front of the one person least prepared to accept it. Michael Carter had driven to his mother's house that afternoon with nothing more on his mind than dropping off a new set of garden tools she had mentioned needing the week before. It was the kind of small favor that had become part of his routine since his father's death. As he turned into the driveway, he noticed Daniel's truck already parked outside. That didn't surprise him. Daniel had been helping Evelyn around the house for months, and Michael had often joked that his best friend had become the family's unofficial handyman. Carrying the box toward the front porch, he smiled to himself, already imagining the three of them sharing coffee before he headed home. But as he reached the front window, he heard voices inside. They weren't arguing. They weren't laughing either. They were speaking so quietly that he couldn't make out every word. Then he heard his mother's voice say, "I've spent too many years pretending I don't deserve to be happy again." A few seconds later, Daniel answered with words Michael never imagined hearing. "I love you, Evelyn. I've tried to fight it because of Michael, because of everything our friendship means to me, but I can't keep lying to myself anymore." Michael stood frozen. The box slipped from his hands and crashed onto the porch, the sound echoing through the quiet afternoon. Inside the house, both Daniel and Evelyn turned toward the front door, their faces immediately drained of color. The moment they opened the door, they found Michael standing there, unable to hide the disbelief written across his face. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Michael looked from Daniel to his mother and back again, searching for someone to tell him he had misunderstood. Instead, the silence confirmed everything. His breathing became heavier as years of trust collided with the words he had just heard. "Tell me this isn't true," he finally whispered, his voice shaking in a way Daniel had never heard before. Daniel took a slow step forward, hoping to explain, but Michael immediately raised his hand. "Don't," he said. "Don't say a single word unless you're about to tell me I imagined all of this." Evelyn tried to reach for her son, but he instinctively stepped back. The distance between them felt much greater than the few feet separating them on the porch. It carried 40 years of friendship, family memories, and loyalty that suddenly seemed impossible to understand. Michael wasn't looking at strangers. He was looking at the two people he trusted most in the world, and in that moment, it felt as though they had chosen each other over him. The pain wasn't rooted in their age difference. It wasn't even about romance. It was the crushing realization that something life-changing had been happening without him knowing. The people closest to him had shared a secret while he remained completely unaware. News spread through the Carter family faster than anyone expected. Sarah's suspicions had been confirmed, and her reaction was immediate. She accused Daniel of crossing a line that should never have been crossed, insisting that no amount of explanation could justify betraying a lifelong friendship. Other relatives quickly took sides. Some argued that Evelyn had every right to seek happiness after years of loneliness, while others believed she had placed her relationship with Daniel above the unity of her own family. Friends who had admired Daniel for decades suddenly avoided him in public. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations ended the moment he entered a room. People who had once praised his character now questioned every visit he had ever made to Evelyn's house, rewriting the past to fit a story they believed they already understood. Daniel accepted the criticism without defending himself because, in many ways, he believed he deserved it. Every time he saw the hurt in Michael's eyes, he questioned whether love could ever justify causing so much pain to someone who had stood beside him since childhood. The hardest conversation came several days later when Daniel met Michael alone at the small fishing dock where they had spent countless summer evenings as boys. Neither man spoke for nearly a minute. The silence between them felt heavier than any argument. Finally, Michael looked out over the water and asked the one question Daniel had feared from the beginning. "When did this start?" Daniel answered honestly. He explained that there had been no affair, no secret romance hidden for years, and no intention of deceiving anyone. He spoke about loneliness after his divorce, about Evelyn's grief after losing Robert, and about how months of ordinary conversations had slowly become something neither of them had expected. "I never went looking for this," Daniel said quietly. "If I could have chosen who I fell in love with, I would have chosen someone else simply to spare you this pain. But feelings don't ask permission before they arrive." Michael listened without interrupting, but the sadness in his expression never faded. "You are like my brother," he replied, "and now I don't know where either of us belongs anymore." Those words cut deeper than any accusation because Daniel knew they were true. Love had brought him closer to Evelyn, but it placed an almost unbearable distance between two men who had once believed nothing could ever separate them. That evening, Evelyn sat alone in her living room, surrounded by decades of family photographs. Pictures of birthday parties, graduations, weddings, and vacations filled the shelves, each one reminding her how much she stood to lose. She quietly wondered whether choosing love meant sacrificing the family she had spent her entire life protecting. As she wiped away tears, her eyes settled on an old cedar chest that had belonged to Robert. It had remained unopened since the months following his funeral. Something inside urged her to unlock it for the first time in years. Beneath neatly folded blankets, faded photo albums, and military keepsakes rested a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with a worn blue ribbon. Each envelope was addressed in Robert's familiar handwriting. Evelyn stared at them in stunned silence, realizing she had completely forgotten they existed. With trembling hands, she untied the ribbon and slowly opened the first letter, unaware that the words written decades earlier were about to reveal a truth so unexpected that it would force Michael, Daniel, and everyone else to question everything they believe about love, loyalty, and the promise a husband leaves behind when he knows he may not have forever. There are moments when a single piece of paper carries more weight than an entire lifetime of arguments. Evelyn Carter held the first letter carefully, afraid that the aging paper might tear in her hands. Robert's handwriting immediately brought back memories she had spent years trying to preserve. Every curve of each letter reminded her of the man she had loved for more than 40 years. She slowly began reading, expecting nothing more than an old love note. Instead, the words stopped her cold. Robert had written the letter several months before his death, during a period when his illness had become impossible to ignore. He admitted that he had accepted the possibility that he might not have many years left, but what frightened him most wasn't dying. It was the thought of Evelyn spending the rest of her life alone because she believed loving someone else would somehow betray his memory. He wrote that he knew his wife better than anyone, and because of that, he feared she would choose loneliness over happiness. One sentence stood out above all the others. If life ever brings another good man into your heart, promise me you won't turn away simply because you once loved me. Loving again doesn't erase what we shared. It honors the life we built together. Evelyn covered her mouth as tears rolled down her face. She had carried guilt for feelings she never intended to have, never realizing that the man she had mourned for years had already considered the possibility that she might someday need another companion. The following morning, Evelyn called Michael and asked him to come to the house alone. At first, he refused. The hurt was still too fresh, and he wasn't ready for another emotional conversation. But something in his mother's voice convinced him to listen. When he arrived, Evelyn quietly handed him the stack of letters without saying a word. Michael recognized his father's handwriting immediately. He spent nearly an hour reading each page in complete silence. Robert wrote about family, faith, forgiveness, and the importance of allowing people to heal instead of trapping themselves in endless grief. In one letter, he admitted that he hoped Michael and Sarah would encourage their mother to keep living after he was gone rather than expecting her to spend the rest of her life protecting a memory. Another letter contained a sentence that left Michael staring out the living room window for several minutes. If the day ever comes when another honorable man makes your mother smile the way I once did, don't see him as someone replacing me. See him as someone continuing the care I can no longer give. Michael had spent weeks believing Daniel had stolen something from his father. Now he realized his father had already imagined this possibility years earlier and had wanted exactly the opposite of what the family had assumed. Robert hadn't wanted Evelyn imprisoned by grief. He had wanted her to live. Even after reading the letters, Michael still wrestled with conflicting emotions. Accepting the truth wasn't immediate. The friendship he shared with Daniel had been damaged, and rebuilding it would take time. Later that afternoon, Michael drove to Daniel's office without calling ahead. Daniel looked genuinely surprised to see him standing at the reception desk. Neither man knew how to begin. They eventually walked outside and sat on a bench overlooking Charleston Harbor, a place where they had often gone as teenagers to talk about their dreams. Michael broke the silence first. I read Dad's letters. Daniel lowered his eyes, unsure what to expect next. For weeks, I kept asking myself how my best friend could do this to me, Michael continued. Then I realized I was asking the wrong question. The real question was why I believed my mother no longer deserved happiness, simply because she had already experienced love once. Daniel struggled to respond. I never wanted to hurt you, he said quietly. There were nights I almost walked away because I couldn't bear the thought of losing your friendship. But every time I saw your mother sitting alone in that house, I realized I wasn't the only one afraid. She was afraid too. Michael nodded slowly before extending his hand. Daniel looked at it for a moment before standing and pulling his lifelong friend into a hug neither of them had imagined possible only days earlier. Neither man claimed everything had been fixed. Some wounds heal slowly. But forgiveness had finally found a place to begin. Several months later, the Carter family gathered once again in Evelyn's backyard. The same lanterns Daniel had helped hang now glowed softly as children laughed across the lawn and conversations filled the evening air. Sarah, who had once opposed the relationship more fiercely than anyone else, watched her mother laughing with Daniel and quietly admitted that she hadn't seen her this happy since Robert was alive. She realized her greatest mistake had been believing love belonged only to the young. Evelyn wasn't trying to replace the past. She was simply refusing to stop living because the past had ended. Michael stood beside an old photograph of his father displayed on a small table during the gathering. Looking at the picture, he smiled and softly said, "You were right, Dad." It wasn't an admission of defeat. It was an acceptance that love isn't divided between people the way possessions are. The heart has an extraordinary ability to honor yesterday while still embracing tomorrow. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond Charleston Harbor, Daniel and Evelyn walked hand in hand along the waterfront where they had shared so many conversations before either of them understood where those conversations would eventually lead. They weren't walking toward a perfect future free from judgment. Some people would always question their relationship. Others would never understand it. But for the first time, neither of them felt the need to defend their happiness. They had learned that love doesn't arrive according to society's expectations, and it certainly doesn't ask whether the timing is convenient. Sometimes it appears after years of loneliness. Sometimes it grows between two people who never imagined they would need each other. And sometimes the greatest act of loyalty isn't refusing to love again. It's having the courage to keep living after loss has convinced you that your story is already over. Daniel had once feared he would lose everything by following his heart. Instead, he discovered that truth, patience, and forgiveness could restore what anger had nearly destroyed. Michael regained not only his closest friend, but also the peace of knowing his mother would never again face life's quiet moments alone. Evelyn finally understood that loving again didn't diminish the beautiful life she had shared with Robert. It fulfilled the final wish of the man who loved her enough to hope she would smile again long after he was gone. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments what you would have done if you were Michael. Would you have accepted the relationship, or would you have struggled to forgive? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy powerful stories about love, family, mystery, and second chances, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the Story Chamber, and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Until next time, thank you for watching. And remember that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin when the world believes they're already too late.